We are going to get started. You guys are all here to talk about JFK. Cory Hughes, our speaker, he wrote a book. He's got many podcasts, too many. I can't remember them all. So please welcome the man, Cory Hughes. And buy his book or I'm choking you out. Test.
Testing. Is this working? So a conspiracy theorist dies and he goes to heaven and he's standing before God. He says, God, I have to know who shot JFK. God looks down at him and he smiles and he said, Lee Harvey Oswald shot JFK and he acted alone. Conspiracy theorist shakes his head. He says, damn it, this thing goes way higher than I thought. My name is Cory Hughes. I'm a Kennedy researcher, and I just put out my first book called A Warning from History. I got my start researching Kennedy back in July of 2018. Prior to that, I was a police officer for about 8.5 years and a crime scene investigator. So all my background came from law enforcement investigations. And I just woke up one day and I realized that I needed to know what happened to Kennedy. And there have been hundreds of books that are titled Kennedy Assassination Solved. And I don't know if you've ever read any of these books, but they haven't solved anything. And so I dedicated the last 5.5 years of my life to really figuring out what happened that day in Dallas on November 22nd. And I think that I have succeeded in that mission. When you dig into the standard Kennedy dogma, you'll find that everyone likes to think that the CIA killed Kennedy and they did it because he was going to pull out of Vietnam. And therefore, by killing him, it gave them the license for endless wars. Now, that thesis unto itself is very easily disprovable. Kennedy just spent $6 billion on helicopters and airplanes. He was not pulling out of any war. Despite what he might have said or any executive memos, you cannot argue with a line item in a budget. So the idea that they needed to get rid of Kennedy to engage in these wars in the first place, I think is rather ridiculous. One of the biggest problems I find with the Kennedy quote-unquote research community is that they all stick to the same, and I'll use this word again, dogma, this idea that you can solve the Kennedy assassination by studying Kennedy. And you really can't. The assassination of President Kennedy is the culmination of close to 100 years of work by a very particular group of people, and it's not the CIA. For me, the study of the Kennedy assassination goes back to 1895 in what's called the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair is what inspired Theodore Herzl in 1897 to introduce to the world a concept known as political Zionism. The first Zionist Congress took place in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. It was that day that a plot was launched covertly to take over the world. And it is a plot that's been underway ever since. If you want to come to understand the relationships behind the assassination, you really need to go to the turn of the century. You really need to look through the Great Depression, World War I and World War II. Everything leading up to November 22nd, 1963 played a role. And it is not as simple as the CIA killed Kennedy. The study of Kennedy is the study of relationships. The relationships primarily between three organizations. The CIA, of course, because they have their hands in everything. The United States Mafia, who in 1963 wasn't run by Sicilian Italians. It was run by Meyer Lansky, who was a Jew. The third organization, which was deeply embedded with these other two, is the Israeli Mossad. To understand this, you need to go back to 1946. David Ben-Gurion had been set up in New York City in Hotel 14, and he had already established a large-scale smuggling operation. that would go on to become the Sonborn Institute, headed by a guy named Rudolph Sonborn, who was a Texas oil guy. He was a front for the organization, which ultimately, over a 20-year period, pilfered all of our armories across the country, stole all of our World War II surplus, and then shipped it back to Israel to fight the Palestinians. And what we're seeing going on in the news today is the culmination of all of this. You have to forgive me. I haven't spoken in front of a crowd since I sold prepaid legal like 10 years ago. So, the first relationship that really needs to be understood if you want to understand the Kennedy assassination goes back to 1946 when David Ben-Gurion sent a guy named Reuven Daphne, an emissary of the Haganah, which was a pre-Israeli Zionist terrorist organization, to go meet with Bugsy Siegel in Los Angeles. This meeting took place, and it was the first of many meetings. Reuven Daphne meets Bugsy Siegel, who's a Jew, and he is shocked to find out that Jews are actually fighting a war. And he asks Reuven Daphne specifically, he said, fighting as in killing? And Daphne said yes. And Bugsy Siegel took a big old swig on his drink and thought for a moment. And he said, I'm in. What do you need? Over the next 3 to 4 months, Bugsy Siegel gave Reuven Daphne about $50,000, which was all sent back to Israel and used in the war against the Palestinians. This was the birth of the relationship between what I call the pre-Israeli Zionists and the United States Mafia. Fast forward to 1949, Los Angeles. This became the home away from home for Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, who at the time were floating around America, upping all these mafia contacts, kind of on the lam from the bombing of the King David Hotel, which is considered the first act of political terrorism in the 20th century. That was the act that was the last straw for the British that got them out of Palestine and allowed Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann and all these guys to incorporate a state of Israel. 1949, Menachem Begin is the personal rabbi of Mickey Cohen. And this becomes extremely important. This is one of the key relationships in the assassination. Because after Oswald is arrested, the first phone call made by Jack Ruby is to a guy named Al Gruber in Los Angeles. Al Gruber was the right-hand man of Mickey Cohen, who in 1963 was in prison at this time. 3 weeks before the assassination, Al Gruber was in Dallas. Basically, he was sent there by the Israeli influence on the mafia, which was basically the entire mafia. So let me rewind a little and explain to you who really ran the mob. Between 1921 and 1931, the mafia was run by a guy named Sal Maranzano. He was really the only Sicilian boss the mafia ever had. Boss of all bosses, a unified boss. A hit was put out on him and Joe Masseria by Meyer Lansky, and it was executed by Lucky Luciano and Albert Anastasia and Lepke Buchalter. These were all Italian Jews. And from 1931 on, the mob was run by Jews, not Sicilians. It was run by Meyer Lansky and his close group, including Lucky Luciano, who was actually out of the picture by late 40s. So you have to understand that relationship and the relationship between the American mafia, which was run by Meyer Lansky, and the pre-Israeli Zionists, up until 48. So when you move further along in this relationship, what you'll find is that starting in around 1956, Zalman Shapiro opens the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation in Apollo, Pennsylvania. They needed a way to smuggle uranium out of the country and to the nuclear reactor in the Negev Desert in Dimona in Israel. which everybody knew the Israelis were building the bomb, but nobody would say anything, not until 1960, when Time magazine did a full expose on it. But by then, everybody knew. By the time Kennedy was killed in 63, we have 3 years of well-documented communications between Ben-Gurion and Kennedy, where he is basically threatening Ben-Gurion, telling him that if he doesn't allow inspectors into Dimona, he's going to cut all aid. Fundamentally, Kennedy was going to end the state of Israel. And they couldn't have that. That was an existential crisis. Okay? So when I hear people talk about killing Kennedy to get out of Vietnam, because he was going to get out of Vietnam, it's just so ridiculous. It was the biggest issue in the world. There was no greater issue for Kennedy or anybody else. He was in secret talks with Khrushchev trying to deproliferate. I can never get that word right. Deproliferate. He wanted to get rid of nukes. That was his #1 issue. And so when he saw the Israelis having this bloodthirst to get the bomb and everything they had done to get the bomb, and how they had stolen our uranium to make their bombs, which was all confirmed years later. The fauna surrounding Dimona was tested at 97.7% enrichment. There's always a kind of nuclear radiation that you can detect in the fauna outside of nuclear facilities. And that is exclusive to nuclear submarines, 97.7% enrichment. So the paths that lead from the Kennedy assassination to Israel are they're overwhelming. These relationships between the CIA, the Israelis, and the mafia. In 1963, they're one organization. I never understood when I started how someone like Jack Ruby could be simultaneously an FBI informant, working with the CIA, working with the mafia, and working with the Mossad. But when you come to realize that in 1963, they were all one organization, really, then everything really starts to make sense. So one of the problems that I feel has been perpetuated by the Kennedy research community is that they've kind of emphasized that this thing is hard and it's impossible and it can't be solved, and people have kind of come to expect that we'll never understand it or have an answer. And I think it's very disingenuous. You can look at all of the evidence, and the evidence paints a very clear picture. Normally my presentation is about 7 hours, so I'm going to summarize the totality of that day for you. Ultimately, the green light was given by David Ben-Gurion, passed down through a Mossad front company called Permindex, which was based out of Switzerland. But after they were involved in the attempted assassination of Charles de Gaulle, they were run out of Switzerland and relocated to South Africa. They had a sub-company called CMC, Centre Mondial Commercial, which was really a mechanism to funnel money. And that's really all it did. And this is where it brings us to Clay Shaw and New Orleans. Clay Shaw had been an active CIA contractor since 47. Witnesses put him and David Ferry together as far back as 47 in Tampa, Florida. When it comes to New Orleans, it really is amazing at what was going on there. It was the hub of anti-Castro activity. And while a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on the anti-Castro Cubans, that is more distraction than anything else. After the orders go through Permindex, which there have been books written on Permindex. It's a fascinating study. They were involved in all kinds of, let's just say, shady stock transfers, money laundering, that kind of thing, like most intelligence organizations. From there, it trickled down to the various mob bosses, through Meyer Lansky to Marcello in New Orleans, Trafficante in Tampa, and Giancana in Chicago. Now, most people think that Giancana was the boss of Chicago. He was a Sicilian Italian. He wasn't. He answered to a guy named Hyman Larner, who answered to Meyer Lansky. Jews ran the mob in every city. The Italians were kept on as front bosses. So ultimately, after it trickles down to the three big mob bosses, the main crew of assassins came from New Orleans and were all based around David Ferry, Guy Bannister, Clay Shaw, and this network of anti-Castro Cubans that they had. Now, the anti-Castro Cuban angle in Kennedy is really distraction. There were two shooters involved who were anti-Castro Cubans, Emilio Santana and Sergio Arcacha Smith. However, they were both bagmen for Carlos Marcello. So the entire idea that anti-Castro Cubans were involved because of the Bay of Pigs is another red herring. It's misdirection. David Ferrie and Clay Shaw and a man believed to have been Oswald were seen at a party in September of 1963 by a guy named Perry Russo. Perry Russo was adamant this person was Lee Harvey Oswald. And at this party, they discussed killing the president. This person was not Lee Harvey Oswald. One of the main themes of my book is to show how the vast majority of stories that we've heard about Lee Harvey Oswald, him being a communist, and everywhere he goes, he likes to talk about communism and talks about rifles, and he went to a rifle range and fired at other people's targets, drawing attention to himself. And everywhere he went and talked about how much he loved the Soviet Union. He was being impersonated by two men in particular, William Seymour and Kerry Thornley. The evidence and the documents that surround New Orleans paint a very clear picture of this. When you look back at the impersonation of Oswald, it was very extensive. The FBI knew about somebody impersonating Oswald by September of 1960. The problem is Oswald is in the Soviet Union at this time. The first incident that we are generally aware of Oswald being impersonated happened in January of 61. In January of 61 at Bolton Ford in New Orleans. You have a man who identified himself as Lee Harvey Oswald, along with another man named Joseph Moore, who went to try to buy a number of trucks to send to Cuba for an organization called the Friends of Democratic Cuba. Now, when you dig into this story, you come to realize, number one, it's not Lee Harvey Oswald. He is most certainly in the Soviet Union at this point. You also come to realize that Friends of Democratic Cuba was a front organization being run by the CIA out of an office on Camp Street run by Guy Bannister, a former FBI and current CIA agent. This is truly the nexus of the assassins in Dallas, particularly, and I'll go through their locations. In reference to the anti-Castro Cubans that were surrounding David Ferrie, you have a guy named Lawrence Howard. Lawrence Howard is a very large, husky Latino, about 6 foot tall, about 250 pounds, and he had moles and marks all over his face. He had a very heavily pockmarked face. What you find is that for a number of years leading up to the assassination, you have incidents where Lee Harvey Oswald was identified as having been accompanied by a large, husky Latino, often described as having a pockmarked face or having moles on his face. When you come to understand the cast of characters, you come to realize that this can only be one person, and that's Lawrence Howard. And Lawrence Howard was a guy who was heavily involved with a group called Interpen down in Miami. Interpen was the Intercontinental Penetration Force run by a guy named Jerry Hemming. He was a basic CIA mercenary contractor, and all these guys at the time were seemingly obsessed with getting into Cuba and freeing Cuba. However, and this is kind of a side note, after the Bay of Pigs, they gave up on Cuba, okay? And all of the information you read about them fundraising for Cuba and all the activities that are allegedly for Cuba post-Bay of Pigs, those were really distraction because all of the arms and all of the money that was raised post-Bay of Pigs ended up going through a company called Interarmco and sent where? Israel, to fight the Palestinians. That's a theme that you will constantly find as you go through the 1950s and 60s in the CIA, is that Israel is such a heavily themed thing. It's truly unbelievable. The allegiance that the leaders of the CIA had to this foreign nation is unexplainable to this day. But back to New Orleans. Sorry, I tend to drift. Lawrence Howard, he is a mercenary type, and he always was accompanied by a guy named William Seymour. William Seymour just so happened to look exactly like Lee Harvey Oswald. A couple inches shorter, a couple pounds lighter, but everywhere that these two went was reported as a sighting of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was accompanied by a large husky Latino. Now, one of the more damning incidents about Lee Harvey Oswald was his interactions with people at the Sportsdrome rifle range in Dallas, where he shot at other people's targets. This incident, once again, not Lee Harvey Oswald. Clearly, William Seymour, all the witnesses who observed him there that day, claimed to have seen him with a husky Latino with a pockmarked face. When you start to see this pattern over and over and over again, you come to realize it's not Oswald and that it is William Seymour and Lawrence Howard everywhere. The description of these two men will also be found on November 22nd in the 6th floor of the book depository, where a husky Latino with something wrong, described as something wrong with his face, as though it is marked in some kind of way. That was described by Arnold Rowland, who witnessed men with rifles on the 6th floor of the book depository. Now, after spending years tracking these various sightings of Oswald, where he's accompanied with a large husky Latino with a pockmarked face, to then find this same description of the man standing in the sniper's nest on the 6th floor, kind of came as a shock to me. But then it all made sense. It all made sense because all of these shooters were revolving around David Ferrie's world in New Orleans. And I also came, and like I said earlier, this is the study of relationships. The study of the assassination is the study of relationships. And so if you have Lawrence Howard on the 6th floor, to find out who else he was with, all you have to do is look back and trace who his associates were. And that would be a guy named Loren Hall and William Seymour, who was impersonating Oswald. Now, another thing I discuss in the book that is probably the most shocking and probably the thing that most people will have a problem with is that I can find no evidence of Lee Harvey Oswald inside the book depository on November 22nd at all, period. I believe it was another front job, like all his other jobs, every job he ever had. Riley Coffee, at a welding company, Jaggers Charles Scoval. He never stepped foot into any of these places. These were all CIA payroll fronts. And I think that's what the book depository was, because the book depository was most certainly a CIA front. Now, we have to use some common sense when it comes to textbooks. Does anybody here believe that anybody can go into business and just start writing textbooks and they can get them into schools? No. This is where the brainwashing begins. And if you're familiar with Goebbels' principles of propaganda, you realize that all propaganda must be controlled by a central entity. In America, that's the CIA. The textbook industry in this country is controlled by the CIA. Every publisher in the book depository, from the Southwest Publishing Company to, God, what else was there? There were 3 or 4, Macmillan, there were 3 or 4 publishing companies in that building. All of those were CIA contractors at least, and outright CIA fronts at worst. The book depository itself was run by a guy named O.V. Campbell, former OSS during the war, kind of an absentee boss. Then you have Roy Truly, also OSS during the war. Then the third guy in charge of the book depository was William Shelley. He was OSS during the war. All 3 of these guys, from the time they got back from the war, went into CIA publishing. All 3 of them. And they were in charge of the building on November 22nd, 1963. So we have 2 shooters on the 6th floor and a shooter on the roof. Sergio Arcacha Smith, who was a former Cuban diplomat, turned anti-Castro Cuban financial grifter in New Orleans. You have these 3 guys inside the book depository. At the Daltex building, which is adjacent to the book depository, I have another person involved in the anti-Castro Cuban movement, Emilio Santana. Now, the evidence for Emilio Santana and Sergio Arcacha being involved in the shooting itself comes from a long story of a woman named Rose Shermy, who reports the assassination 2 days before it happens to a guy named Lieutenant Francis Fruge of the Louisiana State Police. That could do a whole presentation just on that alone. But we have clear evidence of foreknowledge of the assassination, and these 2 men identified as going to be taking part in the assassination. So to actually link them to it wasn't very difficult. When you move over to the grassy knoll, you have that big concrete structure, which is called the pergola. Based on my research, I put a shooter between the pergola and the fence, and I identified that shooter as a guy named Dave Yaris. Dave Yaris at the time was in his mid-60s. He was a longtime Chicago outfit hitman involved in the assassination of Mayor Anton Cermak in Miami in 1931. And so I put him there. His alibi, basically I debunked by comparing the FBI documents. When you go through the documents, like I said in the beginning, all the information I'm presenting and all the evidence that I have in my book is already there. It's already been laid out, but it doesn't seem like anyone's been able to put 2 and 2 together on it. So when you move to the grassy knoll shooter is somebody that everyone's wanted to know. And I've determined that there were two shooters on the grassy knoll. The first shooter who delivered the throat shot, fired from the corner of the picket fence, was shot by a man wearing a black hat with a wide felt band and a dark blue suit. This was observed by a man named Ed Hoffman, who was a deaf mute, who actually provided this information to the Warren Commission. He said that he saw a man fire a shot from the corner of the picket fence. He thought he was smoking a cigarette because he saw smoke, but when the man turned around, he was holding a rifle. He saw this man throw this rifle to another man who was wearing like a railroad outfit. And he broke it down, put it into a toolbox, and both of them just casually walked away. I believe I've been able to verify the statements of Ed Hoffman by comparing his statements to other witnesses who also identify a man wearing the same dark blue suit, black helmet with a wide felt band, behind the book depository fleeing in a gray Plymouth, a 1950s model gray Plymouth. That gray Plymouth will then make an appearance moments later near 10th and Patton, where Officer J.D. Tippett will be gunned down. This man was most certainly David Ferry, identified primarily by a witness named Velma behind the book depository because of his real heavy eyebrows. Now, David Ferry had real heavy eyebrows because he had to paint them on. He had a very unusual appearance. He had to glue his hair on. He had no hair all over his body. Many people thought he had alopecia, which is where you lose all your hair, but I don't think so. Evidence seems to paint the picture that David Ferry was an early U-2 test pilot, and due to the high pressurization in the suits, caused him to lose all of his hair. This was an epidemic amongst the Chinese U-2 pilots. So I believe all the evidence makes it look like he was working with the CIA for a very long time. Now, the last shot delivered to Kennedy took me a long time to figure out who did it. And some people will argue this with me forever, but the shooter on the grassy knoll who took off Kennedy's head was a man by the name of Jack Valenti. And Jack Valenti is a lifelong CIA agent, and he is also the man who ran Hollywood from 1966 until 2004. He was the head of the Motion Picture Association of America. But he lived a double life. He lived a double life. In the war, he was hailed as a bombing pilot, flying some 51 bombing missions, of which there are no record of any of them. He suffered injury at various times in his life that seemed to coordinate or kind of line up with times that there were incidents involving attempted assassinations around the world, which I thought was rather interesting. Jack Valenti is a person who has shaped every single one of our lives. If you watch television or movies beyond 1966, you fell victim to the influence of Jack Valenti. Jack Valenti also sat on the board of directors for the Recording Industry Association of America with a man named Charles Bronfman. He was actually the driving force behind the PMRC. I don't know if many of you remember the PMRC from the 80s. Who tried to get warning labels on all the music. That was a direct result of Jack Valenti. Jack Valenti's main job in his career with the CIA was being the chief censor. He was the head of the industrial censorship complex before that existed. And so when you get into the study of what happened in Dealey Plaza, I'll tell you what I find. I find that most people can't interpret the various contradictions and conflicts in witness statements, but having been a police officer who's interviewed 10,000, 15,000 witnesses, that stuff became very easy to sift through. It's unfortunate that it's been 60 years and we haven't really had any closure on this. And unfortunately, even though in my book I feel like I've answered everything, I don't think we'll get any closure ever. Because no one will ever really know, will they? No. I think that's it. So I could stand here and talk to you about every single aspect of the assassination, but is there anything in particular that you want to focus on? Yes, sir.
Any of those guys still alive?
Yes, one. William Seymour is in Houston. He started a surveying business in the 90s. I guess it's run by his kids these days. I don't have the cojones to call him, so It's not really not really what I do. I like to read books and statements and documents. I'm not really an interviewer, but yes, he's still alive, and I wonder constantly. It really nags at me. Has it been long enough to where he'll talk? Will he talk?
Maybe.
William Seymour, William Houston Seymour. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the post office theory. There was a postman that was the gentleman that was Kennedy when they assassinated him. When he went to the morgue. Have you ever heard that theory where they used a postman?
Okay, so there's a theory that, so J.D. Tippit, who was the officer who was killed at 10th and Patton, there has been a longstanding theory that he looked kind of like Kennedy, and therefore he was killed so they could make alterations to the autopsy photos. So I think that's a bunch of malarkey, personally. When you look at something and it sounds ridiculous, most of the time it is. And I say most of the time because when I tell people that Oswald didn't work at the book depository and he was being impersonated by William Seymour and that everybody in the book depository was a CIA agent who was in on it, they look at me like that's ridiculous and I'm the crazy one, right? So when I say that if it looks crazy, it most likely is, it doesn't always apply because some of the things that I've found to be true are unbelievably shocking. Like Jack Ruby. He was seen in the hallway of the police department. He was seen in the background of a news broadcast at the Dallas Morning News. He was at the midnight press conference. None of those were Jack Ruby. That was Jack Ruby's nearly identical brother, Samuel. Jack Ruby went to Galveston that weekend to bring people back to bring Andrew Jerome Blackman back to his boat because he was in the Merchant Marine and had to get on his ship. So that sounds pretty crazy. And even, I don't think there's any other Kennedy researcher in the world who's made that connection yet. But that sounds pretty crazy on its surface. But when you really get into understanding these people and what they were doing and how the mafia and the CIA were in bed together and they were really developing these kind of techniques together, it's really shocking because the mafia pulled off this body double stuff just as much as the CIA did. So.
Can you talk a little bit about the cover-up? Because there obviously had to be entities within government agencies that kind of had some idea about what's going on. But how is it that this organization, these different entities, were able to coordinate in such a way that they were able to keep things under wraps? You know,
by 1963, everybody worked for the CIA. Everybody, like the whole government worked for the CIA, whether by voluntarily or through blackmail. They got what they wanted one way or another. That's just how it went. So, and if you're this is how I kind of picture it. If you're working in government, and all of a sudden you start to realize this is not above board, and I think my boss might be in on this. Am I going to try to rock the boat?
There you go.
No.
You said that Israel stole United States uranium, highly enriched, but as far as I know, all modern atomic bombs made of plutonium, not uranium. So, and it does not require any kind of highly enriched uranium. It's because it's made inside reactors.
Sure.
So why we need that uranium? How it's related to actual situation?
The NUMEC plant lost 650 pounds between 56 and 65. 9 years, they lost 650 pounds. When the inspectors went in and looked at the normal ratios of how much loss is normal in a reactor, it was off the scale. They found traces on ships. They found actual uranium stuffed into like machine parts. They were caught doing it. This has been well written about. There have been numerous books on this. This isn't conspiracy or speculation. This is history. So, and then when they tested the fauna outside of the nuclear reactor in Dimona, the 97.7% enrichment matched what our U.S. Navy submarines use, which was exactly what was being produced at the NUMEC plant. So, Grant Smith wrote a great book on this called Divert.
Just a quick question, because you mentioned people in government being in on this. Does that include members of the Warren Commission and LBJ? Was he in on it, or where?
I don't believe LBJ was, because when you look back at his career, he was an Israeli puppet from day one. He never won an election, ever. He was basically put in every position he ever had. All the official history on the relationship between Kennedy and LBJ I find very dubious. So I don't believe he knew, because if he knew and it ever came out and he was interrogated, it could come out that he knew, right? And so I don't think that it's not in anyone's best interest to keep your puppet in the loop. You know what I mean? But once it happened, I think he knew exactly what happened. Not to mention, let me just say this. Right after the assassination, he makes it back to Air Force One. General Godfrey McHugh makes it back. He's the first person to get back there after Johnson. He looks around the plane and he can't find him for like 15 minutes. Finally, he finds Johnson crouched down in the shower behind the presidential office on Air Force One, and he's crying hysterically. He says, "It's a plot, it's a plot, they're gonna get us all." That doesn't sound like a guy who was in on it.
Could you share and explain maybe at a high level the CIA Zionist connection? Right, if CIA wasn't interested in killing Kennedy because of the Vietnam issue, if that's a red herring, if it's due to frustrations and pulling aid from Israel and all this, but the whole book depository and the shooters were all CIA sort of oriented, what's the connection between those entities?
So when you look at like who the shooters are and you find the relationship, let's just take the book depository in particular, okay? Lawrence Howard, Lauren Hall, and Sergio Arcacha on the roof, and William Seymour guarding the elevators. That's kind of the scheme that I have put together there. Those guys are all connected through David Ferry in New Orleans and his crew that he was running there. Connected through that is Clay Shaw. Clay Shaw sat on the board of Central Mondial Commercial and Permindex, which were Mossad front companies. Those were the planning and oversight. I consider them like the oversight boards, right? Because you have this overwhelming sentiment amongst everybody, Kennedy's got to go. But of course, I don't believe any of no one on the American side wanted to be a traitor outright and say, okay, let's do this. So they offloaded it. They allowed the Israelis to do it through their relationships with the U.S. mafia.
So did the CIA want the outcome, or
Yes.
were they instruments for the outcome?
Yes, instruments for the outcome is probably the best way to put it. But see, here's another thing. There was definitely some logistical planning done by guys like George Joannidis, who was the head of the psych warfare for the JM Wave station, which was basically Ted Shackley's station out of Miami. So they were involved definitely in some logistics because there were only a couple of people, particularly from that JM Wave station in Miami, who knew all the players, including the Israelis. And that includes Ted Shackley and David Morales and George Joannidis. Those three guys in particular, who I put all in Dealey Plaza that day. So the CIA had to know who was where for the logistics and the contacts. You know what I mean?
It was advantageous to the CIA for this to happen.
Right, but
They
you gotta think-
facilitated, but we're not.
They were kind of like, we don't know anything. Kind of, but see, all the guys who were like shooters were low-level mob and CIA. And that's the thing that really confused me for a long time, is how can you have guys who are working for the American government and they're mob hitmen at the same time?
Yeah.
But it's how it was. It's just how it was. So the relationships that you get into, like when I started to dig into Kerry Thornley, who I didn't really talk about. Kerry Thornley was one of the primary people involved in the setup down in New Orleans, and he was impersonating Oswald all over the place. When you start to dig into him and his connections in New Orleans, you start to get into like another layer behind this of clear CIA cutouts. Guys like Martin McAuliffe, who was a professor at LSU, who clearly introduced some of these people to each other, you know, and then you have guys like Kent Courtney, who was like a rabid right-wing, you know, Minuteman type guy, clearly funded by the CIA, who was putting out like pro right-wing newsletters. He was mentoring some of these guys and introducing them too. So what I'm doing now is I'm kind of digging into these like deeper relationships in New Orleans, where it starts to get a little more obscure. It starts to get a little more hazy on what these guys' role actually was, you know. Because I can connect everybody right up to freaking Hoover and the head of the CIA, but it doesn't mean those guys were in on it, right? Just because they have obvious connections. So I hope I answered the question. The thing, ultimately, when you come to understand those relationships and you understand they're inseparable in '63, then it all starts to make a whole lot more sense.
It's kind of a just a title difference.
Yeah, I'd say it's like a Venn diagram, but like 90% of it overlaps.
Okay.
I've read a book by Jacob Hornberger about the Kennedy autopsy. Do you have any thoughts on how the autopsy might have been falsified?
Well, the autopsy had to have been falsified because when I look at the number of shots fired, like Kennedy was shot in the back twice. The official story says he was only shot in the back once. But in the Warren Commission exhibits, you will find, it's called Jacket Exhibit, and then there's a number attached to it. and it shows the back of the jacket. Clearly, he was shot in the back twice. Once below the collar and once in the middle of the back. So when you look at stuff like that, and then you look at what they tell us, how there were only 3 shots, only 2 of them hit, caused 20 injuries, you know, they had to fake everything. I don't spend a lot of time on things like proving Oswald was a CIA agent. Stuff like that is a given. Like, it's obvious he was doing intelligence kind of stuff, right? Autopsy. I didn't spend a lot of time on it because it's obvious they tampered with it. The biggest proof of the tampering of the autopsy comes from the Harper fragment. He was shot from the front. This section of the head, real classy. This section of the head was blown off, right? This is the occipital lobe, and it was found in Dealey Plaza by a guy named Harper, and it was turned in. So when you look at the photographs of the autopsy, that's intact, and so obviously that was clearly tampered with. So yeah, I never put a lot of time into things that I thought were obviously BS.
I had a question about Meyer Lansky and Zionism a little bit more. So I'm wondering, you know, I was always taught growing up that Zionism was the search for a Jewish homeland as opposed to politically dominating the world. So I was wondering, is there like a subsect of Zionists that you identified as being integral to this? And also with Meyer Lansky, like, I always thought that Italians didn't want non-ethnic Italians running things, so how does that work? And is there any connection between Meyer Lansky and maybe a subsect of Zionism that you can identify?
Well, from what I gathered in this research is that when these Jewish mob guys came to understand that this was even going on, that this was even a thing, that there was even the potential for a Jewish homeland, that there were even Jewish anything, Jewish armies, they were like enthralled from day one. They couldn't believe it. They were like, oh my God, our people are rising up, and they were on board from day one. Like, so do I say that they were Zionists? They were Zionists in essence, but probably not name. They weren't probably educated enough on the politics of it to know. I mean, honestly, they were thugs. Meyer Lansky was a thug. I mean, these guys weren't exactly college educated, you know. But the split second they found out that there was a Jewish movement, they were all on board, like instantly. And that's where the relationships came through, and that's why Meyer Lansky agreed to help with all the uranium stuff and the Sonborn Institute and the exporting of the theft and exporting of all the arms to Israel. Like, so in 1962. David Ferry and Arcacha and Leighton Martins and a couple of these guys broke into an arms depot in Houma, Louisiana. And they cleaned the place out. They eventually get caught. I mean, years later, they get charged by Garrison. But everyone always thought that those arms and weapons were going to the anti-Castro Cubans. They weren't. They were all deflected, and we know this from a guy named Gordon Novell, to a company called Inter-Armco, which was a CIA cutout for a guy named Samuel Cummings. Samuel Cummings, by the way, is the guy who imported the Carcano rifle. And so all those arms ended up going to Israel, right? So we have over 20 years from 45 through at least 62 that they were pilfering our arms and weapons from all these bunkers. So it was a big deal for a while, but a lot of the research, a lot of the documents on these break-ins has been disappeared, covered up. So.
Years ago, I watched this documentary called Frame 313, which posited 5 different theories,
right,
and maybe collectively all of them are true. The first one is that Kennedy wanted to take the power back from the Federal Reserve,
right,
and put it back into the Treasury and print up silverback notes.
Right.
The other one is that when Sam Giancana, the Chicago boss,
right,
he worked with the Daily Machine to get the votes out, and that Kennedy won by the narrowest margin ever.
Well, he stole the election.
Stole the election. And then part of that issue was when Bobby Kennedy started to go after the mob, Sam Giancana felt betrayed. And so they were going to put a hit out on Joe Kennedy at one time,
right,
because he was running illegal whiskey during the Prohibition era.
Yeah, they didn't really like the Kennedys, but
no.
And then they did feel burned. Like they didn't find him.
And then also Kennedy wanted to repeal the oil depletion allowance. So I don't know if you know anything about Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison was it was J. Edgar Hoover, it was Nixon, it was LBJ, and they all met at Clint Murchison's house on November 21st
right,
in Dallas, Texas.
Right,
And
so
then
I've dug
J.
into that.
Hoover was there as well.
I've dug
So
into that story
interesting
big time.
coincidence, I don't think.
I can't find any actual evidence for that story other than Madeline Brown.
Okay.
The ex-girlfriend, who honestly she claims to be the love of Lyndon Johnson's life, provably false. The love of Lyndon Johnson's life was his secretary, Mary Margaret Wiley, who actually married Jack Valenti, who was actually gay and married her as a beard. So.
And what about L.B. Celestes and Bobby Baker?
Okay, so Bobby Baker is extremely important in all of this, and it's not something I've had a lot of time to get into, but Bobby Baker's prostitution ring, he was Jeffrey Epstein 1.0, in case people aren't familiar, and that direct ties to Kennedy because he was having sex with a Soviet spy named Ramesh at the time, and that was all going to come out, and then Kennedy gets killed, and all of this goes away, and the Bobby Baker scandal goes away, and Lyndon Johnson gets saved and put in the White House, and killing Kennedy solved so many problems. But people try to assign the blame to each and every one. And that's just not the way it goes. Ultimately, like I said, Kennedy was going to change the world and get rid of the state of Israel. And that's why they took him out.
We're going to do 3, maybe 4 more questions, and then that's it.
This is 2 simple ones. One, was Jack Ruby's name actually Jack Ruby?
Rubenstein. It was Rubenstein, but he changed it.
Okay.
He changed it. He added a middle name, Leon. So one thing I picked up in my research, you get a bunch of guys that you come across in the mafia over the years who incorporated the name Leon or Wayne as a middle name. I've kind of come to believe that these are ranks of some sort. So.
Second question, have you ever seen the video of the driver turning around and basically shooting?
Yeah, that's pushed by a documentary called Everything's a Rich Man's Trick. That's a CIA propaganda film. That film names everybody from Santa Claus to the Wolfman as having killed Kennedy. One of the biggest things is like one of these films pushes the idea that a guy named James Files shot Kennedy from the grassy knoll using some exploding bullets. This guy's a complete fraud. The whole story about how they recruited him to do this is out there. So the real story no one's ever told before because no one's ever seen. The evidence for the shooters on the grassy knoll come from 2 photographs. McIntyre photo number 1 and McIntyre photo number 2. When the Secret Service car, which is right behind Kennedy's limousine, pulls into Dealey Plaza, there's 10 men on the car. 2 of them get off. Dave Powers exits the vehicle because he knows what's coming. And Clint Hale gets off and runs to the limousine and hops on the back of the limo. So there should only be 8 people left in the limousine. However, by the time they get to the underpass, they're back to having 10 men in the limo. They picked up 2 passengers on the way out of Dealey Plaza. Those 2 men were Jack Valenti and David Morales. David Morales being longtime CIA handler of great notoriety everyone should be aware of, and the other person was Jack Valenti. And I think this is brutally obvious from the photographic record alone.
I was wondering, Robert Kennedy, like a presidential candidate, he's always been skeptical about the theory. He's been saying that he thinks the CIA is involved. I'm pretty sure he also contests the autopsy. And he also, I think he claimed that if he was going to become president, which probably is not going to happen, he would go and look into, but he never said what was his theory. I was wondering if you have any, if he knows, or if he's into something, or do you think
I have no idea. I know people who know him, and they can't tell me. They can't even tell me. But he did name publicly the shooter of his father. I mean, everyone knows Sirhan can't fire 13 bullets from an 8-shot revolver. So Robert Kennedy was killed by Thane Eugene Caesar, and it was the same organization. It was the same organization: the Israelis, the mafia, and the CIA, all working together. I decided not to get into Robert Kennedy because, honestly, it's too easy. The information on who did what in that one is way too simple. So.
Quick question. Somebody had to make the decision. Who do you think made the decision?
So that's an interesting thing. I don't think there was like somebody said, go do this. I think it was more greenlit. Like it was brought to people and it was like kind of okayed, you know. But I can tell you with certainty, what I consider the oversight board for the whole thing is this organization, Permindex. The Permanent Industrial Exhibit is what it was short for. Started by a guy named George Mandel, who changed his name to George Mantello because he wanted to sound more Italian when he moved there. Mossad operative. And this company conducted no known business in the years that they were around. And all they did was hold stock and have a bunch of meetings. And it is very much believed that the green light to kill Kennedy was handed down to the board of directors of Permindex, which included Dulles, Dulles, Angleton, Joe Bonanno, Modalites, who were mob bosses, Gershon Perez. I mean, it was a who's who of intelligence, mafia, you name it. It's the proof that the CIA, the mafia, and the Mossad all work together. So it's pretty much, I think, well established in research circles that the final go-ahead came from Permindex. The money was funneled through their sub-company, Central Mondial Commercial, and that's where you get to Clay Shaw in New Orleans, which is where the bulk of the planning and stuff went on. But I put, on the top of the overpass, I put Robert Bernard Baker, who was the right-hand man of Jimmy Hoffa at the time. See, New Jersey was kind of under the guidance of Chicago. Chicago kind of ran like a bunch of the smaller cities, right? So New Jersey at the time was kind of under the guidance of Chicago still. So when I look at people like Robert Bernard Baker being the fat guy standing on the overpass, to me that's still a Chicago outfit, even though it's coming from Jersey, right? Same thing with Cleveland, like the Three Tramps. So the Three Tramps, to me, I believe that they were Vincent Calderon Jr., who I'm not even going to talk about at all because that would take me like hours. Most interesting person in the entire assassination who no one's ever heard of. But Danny Green, the Irishman, and Leo Mosseri, who was his boss at the time in 1963. Danny Green was the head of the Longshoremen. The Longshoremen was a mob organization back then. So, I'm sorry. Did I answer your question? I don't even remember what the question was. I have a tendency to do that sometimes.
Last question.
All right.
You said the fatal shot was from the grassy knolls.
Correct.
Which would have been a forward shot.
Correct.
What was the range?
God, from there, just from remembering from being there, can't be more than 30, 40, 50 feet. Like, not that far at all. It's tiny. Have you ever been to Dealey Plaza?
No.
It's small. It's like the size of this room. It's like when you actually see it in person, you'll be shocked. Like, they could have killed Kennedy by throwing a rock at him. It was so small.
Okay.
Okay, we'll do one last question. Make sure it's a question.
When Kennedy fell on the sword for the Bay of Pigs fiasco, he made a comment that I want to take the CIA and break it up into 1,000 different pieces and cast it to the winds. And what did he do? He fired Allen Dulles, and there was a second in command was Charles Cobble. Charles Cobble's brother, Earl Cobble, was the mayor of Dallas.
Correct.
Curious coincidence, but then all of a sudden, Allen Dulles is the head of the Warren Commission.
Right.
Justice Warren Burger, he didn't want to take the job, but LBJ said we wanted to give this thing an air of credibility. So do you think that's the fox in charge of the hen house? And there are so many of the people, that's why they have the substitute thing on assassination that came out in the late 70s. And so a lot of the people that were on the Warren Commission, they thought they were not allowed to see certain evidence. So I don't know if anything was made of the connection between the mayor of Dallas and the firing of the CIA officials.
So it's an obvious connection, right? And the thing about that connection there is there's only a handful of people who I can see that being applicable for any orders to have been passed down. Because when I look at like the involvement of the Dallas police, Dallas sheriff, even Bill Alexander of the district attorney's office, what you'll find is that all of these people were hanging out with Jack Ruby, which is crazy. Like, the guy's a scumbag mafia guy, right? So,
the carousel.
Right. And he had another one, the Vegas Club, also. So, yeah, it seems as though all of the passing of information in Dallas could have gone through Jack Ruby, because Jack was making trips to New Orleans, numerous documented trips to New Orleans, a lot of trips to Houston. A lot was going on in Houston. There was a huge intelligence hub going on down there. Like David Ferry goes to the Winterland ice skating rink, and that's like used as his alibi. Well, he never went there, actually. That's a whole nother story. But that was a CIA front also. So every single thing. It's funny because they in the assassination they use all these various elements, like the shoe store ran by Johnny Brewer when Oswald allegedly flees to the theater. Well, when here we are 60 years later, when you start to dig into all these individual places that they used for specific markers, I call them, you can find the clear intelligence or mafia connections to all of them. It's like they picked a bunch of places that they knew they could stage events in, not realizing we would figure out they were staged events 50 years later, which is exactly what most of what we know about the assassination has been, a series of staged events. Like Oswald on the street corner handing out flyers. Completely set up and staged in advance. I can tell you the entire series of events that got Oswald on television. And from being on television, what that got for Oswald. I mean, it's all traceable back to CIA agents in New Orleans. So.
Why did Bobby Kennedy extradite
That's our talk.
Sorry. I do have books if you guys, I have 8 books left if anybody's interested.
Thanks everybody for coming out. Buy this man's book. You better not leave with any copies. We'll see you all back in 2 weeks. Mike Tremont will be here. So thanks for coming. Drive safe. Have a good night and keep fighting the state.